Hello everyone, my name is William, aka the Swedish Polyglot, and in this video I will convey what I've learned about language learning from reading the book The Moral Landscape: How Science Can Determine Human Values by philosopher and neuroscientist Sam Harris. Since this is my first video, I should probably introduce myself. I call myself the Swedish Polyglot since 1. I'm Swedish, and 2. My last name is too long and complicated to use as a brand name, and 3. I've spent the last 4 years learning languages on a daily basis to the point where I can now understand 8 languages at an intermediate level or higher. I'm a psychology student and I teach languages and how to learn them in my spare time. There's a link in the description to my italki profile where I teach. If you're interested in learning Swedish and or languages in general with me, face to face, then you can go ahead and click that link below. Now, this video is part of a series that I will be calling What Books Taught Me About Language Learning. The books that I will cover in this series aren't necessarily about language learning per se. In fact, most of them aren't. But I'm a big proponent of the so-called cross-field application of ideas. This is the idea that many ideas translate from one domain to another. In fact, it has been argued that this is one of the underlying drivers of creativity. Taking old ideas from one domain and applying them in a new domain. The structure of the rest of the video will be as follows. I will first summarize the premise of the book. Then I will demonstrate how these ideas can be translated to the context of language learning. And finally, I will end the video with a summary and give some practical advice on how you can apply these ideas in your own language learning. You can think of these videos more as short podcast episodes. I like to listen to these types of videos at 1.5 to 2x the speed, maybe while doing other things. I recommend that you do the same. In the book, A Moral Landscape, the author Sam Harris promotes a science of morality and argues that many thinkers have long confused the relationship between morality, facts, and science. He aims to carve a third path between moral relativists who say that morality is subjective and religionists who say that morality is given by God and Scripture. Harris contends that the only moral framework worth talking about is one where morally good things pertain to increases in the well-being of conscious creatures. He then argues that moral questions will have objectively right and wrong answers, which are grounded in empirical facts about what causes people to flourish. Challenging the traditional philosophical notion that humans can never get an ought from an is, Harris argues that moral questions are best pursued using not just philosophy, but the methods of science. Thus, science can determine human values translates to science can tell us which values lead to human flourishing. It is in this sense that Harris advocates that scientists begin conversations about a normative science of morality. Harris identifies 3 projects for science as it relates to morality. 1. Explaining why humans do what they do in the name of morality. 2. Determining which patterns of thought and behavior humans and societies should follow if they are to maximize human well-being. And this would be the science of morality that Harris argues for. And 3. Generally persuading humans to change their ways. Now, Sam argues that states of well-being and suffering map onto a landscape of possible experiences. And just as a landscape has multiple peaks and valleys, he argues that there are different paths that can lead us to different peaks and valleys of well-being and suffering. In other words, there are multiple ways of maximizing well-being. Furthermore, he argues that, at least in principle, a science of morality could help us to more effectively traverse these peaks. To summarize, 1. There are better and worse ways of maximizing well-being for individuals and groups and societies. 2. There are several different paths to attaining peak levels of well-being for individuals and societies. 3. Science can, at least in principle, help us to more effectively traverse this landscape of possible experience, even though for certain moral questions and dilemmas, it may be difficult to find answers in practice. So, how do these ideas translate to language learning? There are better and worse ways of maximizing well-being. This translates to there are more or less effective and enjoyable ways of learning languages. Now, this one seems pretty obvious, and I think most language learners agree on this one, so I won't spend too much time on it. But one thing to notice here is that at any point in time in our language learning journey, we may be unaware of where on the landscape of effectiveness we find ourselves, or how close to a peak or valley we really are. This fact should urge us to experiment, look for limitations in our approach, read and learn, etc., in order to make our language learning more effective and, in extension, more enjoyable. So in summary, some of us may believe that we are close to a peak, but I would invite you to always assume that you're not. This is a helpful assumption, since the only way to improve our language learning method over time is to keep looking for limitations in our approach and improving on them. The same applies to your level of enjoyment. You may, at a given point in time, in fact not know where you are on the landscape of possible enjoyment in your language learning journey. You may furthermore believe that where you are in terms of enjoyment is all there is. This may, for example, be common for learners who follow a formal education approach to language learning, where external incentives, such as getting good grades, are primary. So, I would also invite you to reason about and experiment to see how you can traverse the landscape of enjoyment as it pertains to your language learning. This is something that I will talk about and go more in depth on in future videos. Idea number 2. There are several different paths to attaining peak levels of well-being. This translates to: there are several different paths, i.e. selection of methods, tools, content, mindsets, etc., that lead to maximum effectiveness and enjoyment in language learning. The reason for this being that while there are biological factors in common for all of us, there are also moderating factors on top of these biological factors that cause individual differences. For example, while generally enjoying the process of language learning may be a universal component of long-term success, people tend to enjoy different things. People enjoy different types, forms, and genres of content. There are also universal components of enjoyment that we all share, such as the flow state, but I will cover that in a future video. In summary, some factors are more or less susceptible to individual differences. In psychology, there are two concepts that are relevant here. The first one being equifinality, and this refers to the observation that in any open system, such as a human being, a diversity of pathways may lead to the same outcome. So, for example, if you take 100 people and give them different methods, content, mindsets, etc., some of these people may achieve the same, or at least a similar outcome. The second concept is multifinality, which is kind of the opposite. It refers to the observation that in any open system, such as a human being, the same causes may lead to different outcomes. So, for example, if you take 100 people and you give them the same method, content, mindsets, etc., they may achieve varying outcomes due to individual differences, their environments, etc. So, to conclude here, what you want to do is that you want to find out, 1, what the universal aspects of language learning are. What is in common for all of us if we want to achieve success in language learning, i.e. enjoying the process, having massive input, making that input comprehensible to a certain extent and compelling, having an active part of our learning and a passive part, making it a part of our identity, having efficient mechanisms in place for looking up information, such as the meaning of words and their pronunciation, etc., etc. And 2, what relevant individual differences should I accommodate for, i.e. what sort and form of content do I like to consume, and how and when do I like to consume it, etc., etc. And by accommodating these two categories into your approach, you can more effectively traverse the landscape of possible effectiveness and enjoyment in your language learning journey. Idea number 3. Science can in principle help us to more effectively traverse this landscape of possible experience, even though for certain moral questions and dilemmas, it may be difficult to find answers in practice. Translating this to language learning, we get: science and reason can in principle help us more effectively traverse this landscape of language learning effectiveness and enjoyment, even though it may sometimes be difficult to do this in practice. Now, in contrast to a science of morality, a science of second language acquisition is something that we do in fact have. So I won't be arguing for the need of one, but I would rather argue that we as language learners should take advantage of the existence of one. I would urge you to, apart from learning about language learning from your online gurus, your blogs, your YouTube channels, etc., to also read and learn about the actual science of second language acquisition. Now, a good book on this topic, a good introductory book on this topic is How Languages Are Learned, 4th edition, Oxford University Press. As a second point here, I would invite you to think about science in a more inclusive way. I would invite you to think of yourself as a scientist working towards building an increasingly nuanced model of how you personally learn languages. Similar to how a community of scientists would advance their field through experiments, coming up with hypotheses, and testing them, looking for limitations in current methods, theories, and models, etc., etc. You can, as an individual, advance your own personal conception of how languages are learned. You do this by collecting and consuming information from different sources: scientific literature, books, polyglots, blogs, other learners, etc., etc. As you do this, you want to rely on reason to parse the information that you consume, and in this way learning over time through what lenses to evaluate information related to language learning. As an example, you may, for example, read about the input hypothesis, which states that languages are mostly acquired through input, so listening and reading, for example, and that this input should furthermore be comprehensible to some extent and compelling as to maximize its usefulness. Now, after having learned about this hypothesis and verifying that it seems pretty reasonable, you can now evaluate different content, ways of consuming content, and tools from the lens of if it is or makes your input more or less comprehensible and compelling. And just to clarify, comprehensibility refers to what extent you can comprehend whatever input you're consuming. That something is compelling is the same as it being interesting, enjoyable, conducive for flow, etc. Now, I will cover this theory and similar theories in more depth in future videos. Moving on. So, additionally, just as a scientist, you want to seek and or be open to information that may falsify your hypotheses about language learning. You don't want to fall in the trap of confirmation bias, which is the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information that confirm or support your prior beliefs and values. So to conclude, the purpose of becoming your own little personal science community is to bridge the gap between the science of second language acquisition and language learning in practice. After all, you don't want to wait for science to figure everything out for you before you start learning. But on the other hand, we also want to stand on the shoulder of science, as it were, to benefit from whatever facts that have already been collected and established. So essentially, we want to leverage formal science towards the purpose of advancing our own informal science. And this concludes part 1 of the first episode of What Books Taught Me About Language Learning. In the next and final part of this episode, I will be covering an additional 3 ideas that can be extracted and translated to language learning from the same book, The Moral Landscape by author Sam Harris. To conclude this video, I would encourage you to think about how ideas you learn in one domain, be it psychology, linguistics, engineering, etc., can be applied in other domains, for example language learning. The boundaries we create between fields of knowledge are mostly artificial, and there is no reason to pay them too much respect. And if you have similar experiences applying ideas from one domain in another domain, please leave a comment down below. I would be glad to hear about your experiences. Finally, if you're interested in the topics of language learning and thinking about ideas, and you like this episode, then you might be interested in subscribing to my channel for future content. Also, of course, I recommend that you pick up The Moral Landscape in book form or as an audiobook. And there's also a very solid TED Talk by the author under the same name on YouTube. Thank you very much for listening, and see you in the next video.